The third caveat is this. The President, I think, and understandably, sees his speech and his policy as a kind of corrective to his predecessors, to what George Bush has done. He is very anxious to restore the United States moral authority in this part of the world. That's why he talked about his decision to ban torture and to close down Guantanamo Bay. And I think he subtly signaled his repudiation of George Bush's freedom agenda in its full splendor, that is, linked to military coercion or intervention in Iraq, the utopian sweep of it, the sort of Hegelian idea that this is an unstoppable force of history that is sweeping through the Middle East, which you heard this kind of language in 2005 from the administration, but it's but they obviously changed their tune. And there was, more than a whiff of opportunism in the president's embrace of the freedom agenda after things really began to go south in Iraq. So it's understandable why President Obama would want to distance himself from his predecessor's general approach. But I think it's important to recall that the roots of this mistrust, of the antagonisms here, well predate George Bush's presidency. It's not as though this is some kind of bizarre anomaly in an otherwise placid relationship between the United States and peoples and nations in the greater Middle East. I believe that, after all, Al-Qaeda declared jihad on Bill Clinton's watch. So we've got a half century of engagement in the Middle East. The United States does, and I think during that period we've often been afflicted by a kind of strategic myopia. We always seem to be very reactive. We run around from fire to fire trying to extinguish them, and rarely do we relate them to each other. Rarely do we look deeply into the structural causes of the region's ills. And so I have to say this: it's not easy for me to say nice things about George Bush. But he was not always wrong, like a broken clock that twice a day at least gets the time right. And I think Condi Rice was correct when she was in Cairo, and she talked about how America's pursuit of stability in the greater Middle East had been counterproductive. It aligned us with corrupt and incompetent despots, and it helped reinforce the conditions that have been so ripe for the breeding of extremism in the region. Harsh political repression, economic stagnation, a sense of cultural anxiety and eclipse, and even humiliation. And here I'm not accusing this administration of embracing realism, but one does sort of hear hints of a more realpolitik view in its talk about the Middle East and other countries as well. And again, it's mostly an attempt to correct the overreaching of the Bush administration, but I hope we don't overcorrect and embrace a realism that has always been blind to the importance of what happens within countries, how they are structured, the presence of a lack of accountable political institutions, and how that affects their external behavior. We made a Faustian bargain in this region. First, we sided with the autocrats as bulwarks against communism. Then now we are siding with them as bulwarks against Islamism. And I think it's time for us to finally break with this policy of, or what the syndrome of what my friend Reza Aslan calls legitimacy of blackmail. And we've got to find ways to align American policy with the people's aspirations and not the interest of their rulers. And we've got to make accountable government and economic opportunity centerpieces of that policy. Let me close with this idea. And this is something that PPI has been talking about for several years, and particularly the work that Ed Gresser, our trade and international economic expert, has talked about. I don't think we should for a minute step back from our support for democracy and human rights in the region. On the contrary, I think it ought to be the defining feature of our diplomacy. Obviously it entails risk, and obviously it entails striking delicate balances. But we've got to stand up for dissidents and reformers of all kinds. We've got to build civic infrastructure, which creates a sinew of a real representative and democratic society. We shouldn't fear elections, and we should support the incorporation of nonviolent Islamic parties in politics, as our friend Shafi Hamid has written for PPI and for other groups. But we also should elevate prosperity. I notice it's number 7 of the 7 out of 7 on President Obama's list of issues with the region. I think it ought to be up there near the top. The greater Middle East is an outlier in the global economy. Population has been exploding, almost doubled since 1980. At the same time, its economy, the region's economy, has been shrinking. This is a combustible mix. It means lots of young people, lots of young men pouring out of universities with bleak job prospects. The share of exports coming from the region has just collapsed. All of the countries of the greater Middle East combined get as much foreign direct investment as Sweden or Singapore. So this is not a plea for a Marshall Plan, as euphonious and as good as that sounds. We're not talking about aid here. What we're really talking about is trade, a much more powerful tool for transformation, it seems to me, of the economic realities in this part of the world. Back in the Cold War days, we knew how to align our trade and economic strategies better with our national political strategy. We've lost sight of that, and the Middle East is what we call the blank spot on America's trade policy map. So we believe that we need to look hard at how to lift tariffs, a general kind of, like the African trade agreement, a general tariff reduction for the moderate Middle Eastern nations that denounce terrorism and cooperate with Middle East peace experts. This wouldn't cost the U.S. taxpayers anything, and if we could get our friends in Europe and around the world, Japan and China, to join forces, we could have a very galvanic effect on jobs and opportunities and living standards in this region. Sometimes I can understand how people in the Middle East could see Americans talking about democracy as a species of political colonialism, but nobody surely is going to object to rising living standards. And as that happens, and as people get jobs and opportunities integrated into the global economy, the spirit of coexistence is bound to go with that. So with those remarks, thank you very much.